left to right, suppose my left, so starting with the Comptroller, to introduce yourselves in 1 minute or less. And we're going to try to stick to the time constraints that we talked about ahead of time. We all watched the presidential debate, so we'll try to abide by the rules a little better than they did. But if we could start, Comptroller Franchot, and go over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to particularly thank the Renters Alliance for hosting what is a very, very important discussion we're going to have. Let me just say very clearly at the outset, no one wins when a family is evicted. No one wins. Everyone loses. It's a lose, lose, lose situation. The 127,000 families that were mentioned who are behind on their rent, they lose their home potentially. Landlords lose their income. Our communities suffer. Maryland's economy suffers. At this moment, there are hundreds of millions of federal dollars in the state's bank account to cover rents lost due to the pandemic, and hundreds of millions of federal dollars on their way. We have the ability to make landlords whole with this money and prevent evictions, but we need a statewide uniform process for applying for the funds and distributing the funds. That's why I've officially requested that Governor Hogan immediately declare a state of emergency and reinstate the eviction moratorium. In the absence of this, counties and the city leaders must use their emergency powers that they have to take action now and declare that their own states of emergency eviction moratoriums until we until we can get these funds flowing. I mean, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. We have the money. It's sitting, $750 million. It's going to be returned to the federal government if we don't get it to the landlords to pay them for past rent that's due.
Thank you.
So let me just add.
Thank you, Comptroller.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
God bless you. Thank you.
Mr. Gansler.
Thank you. By way of reintroduction, my name is Doug Gansler. I went to elementary school about 2 miles from here at Chevy Chase Elementary. I still live about 2 miles away from here. I served the public as Assistant United States Attorney, as the State's Attorney of Montgomery County, and as the Attorney General of Maryland. And I'm seeking the Governor's chair again. And the issues tonight are wonderful, and I really appreciate you having this conference. We've done this in this particular forum many times in the past on issues that mean so much to Montgomery County, to Silver Spring, to the state of Maryland. I just would touch on 2 quick issues. When I was president of all the Attorneys General of the United States, we had the national mortgage foreclosure crisis, and we were able to keep hundreds of thousands of people in their homes fighting the big banks from being evicted. And then secondly, in Baltimore, we don't have them here in Montgomery County, but there was something called ground rents, and people were being thrown out for not paying $26 bills and evicted from their houses, and we stopped that when I was Attorney General. I look forward to working with you in the future as your governor.
Thank you. Mr. Jain.
All right. How's everyone doing, first of all? All right. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Ashwani Jain. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a 32-year-old cancer survivor who's a son of immigrants, a product of Maryland public schools. I've worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and I worked in the Obama White House and 2 federal agencies. And at the end of the day, I am running for governor to make our politics more inclusive and accessible. That's why we have built one of the largest grassroots campaigns in Maryland, and that's why I'm focused on my Maryland Now plan, which touches on affordable housing issues, is fully paid for, and will do 5 things. Eliminate your state income tax, make Maryland the first state to make public transit free, make sure that we have the first guaranteed jobs program in the nation, legalize marijuana and expunge records, and impose anti-corruption measures. I'm happy to share more tonight, but you can also visit janeforgovernor.com to find out more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. Mr. King.
Good evening. Grateful to the Renters Alliance and all the housing advocates in the room. I'm John King. I had the privilege of serving as United States Secretary of Education for President Obama, but I started my career as a teacher and principal and saw firsthand how homelessness and housing insecurity affected my students and their families. I think our conversation tonight has to start with the principle that housing is a human right. And if we assume, that's right, and if we understand housing to be a human right, then we have to change our policy. And I'm campaigning as a strong progressive and will govern as a strong progressive, and to me that means we have to start with much stronger tenants' rights protections in Maryland. We have to deal with the COVID crisis by reinstating the moratorium statewide, but we have to look at our systems and change those. We have to have a right to counsel for tenants that is funded so that tenants are supported when they go to court. That's right. We have to make sure that we're building a supply of affordable housing in the state. We have to make sure that we have a just cause eviction law, as was proposed by Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Mr.
Right?
King.
Those are the things that we need to do, and we have to commit to those
Thank
tonight
you.
and then campaign on them.
Thank you so much. Mr. Moore.
Thank you very much, and good evening. First, I do want to just add that I know for all of us, but my thoughts and prayers are with the Baker family this evening. He's a dear friend, and we know what his family's going through right now. And I'm excited and I'm proud to be here to have a conversation with you all about what's at stake here. Because right now, we know that there are around 200,000 of our neighbors who are at risk of eviction. And that we have a shortfall of affordable and accessible housing. And we know that there are things that we can and we should be doing about it and moving about it and quickly. This is a moment where we have a chance and we have resources to stress the fact that yes, housing is a human right, but the reality is it's been a human right. And we have not addressed it as such. And so we are at a fundamental turning point and a fundamental breaking point within this state. And I'm running for governor because I want to increase economic opportunities for everybody, to make this a state where we can focus on work and wages and wealth for all Marylanders. To know that there's not a reason for a single Marylander to feel insecure about their position or where they are or about their housing status.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Perez.
Good evening. I'm Tom Perez, and I'm also running for governor. And today is World Alzheimer's Day. You may not have known that. And so let's keep Rashern and the family in our thoughts and prayers. We all agree that housing should be a right for all and not a privilege for a few. And we all know that it's not. And we all know that we have a lot of work to do to make sure that it becomes such a right. And in the eviction context, we have a rare opportunity. We can prevent 100% of evictions. We have the resources to do it. What we have lacked in this state is the leadership to do this. If we looked in Virginia, in New York, in Colorado, and elsewhere, we saw sustained leadership. And what we see in moments of crises, and our next governor is going to inherit multiple crises, the best way to figure out what someone's going to do in the future is to look at what they've done in the past. During the last housing crisis, I had the privilege of helping to lead the effort to pass sweeping foreclosure prevention reforms to help folks here in Maryland as your state labor secretary. And then as your assistant attorney general for civil rights, I took on those banks. We settled a case against Wells Fargo. Tens of thousands of Marylanders, mostly black and brown people, who were totally screwed by lenders. That's important. Understanding past is indeed prologue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our candidates. Feel free to give them a round. So now it's my privilege to introduce our panel of distinguished reporters that will be asking questions to our candidates. First, as was mentioned before, there are volunteers walking around the room with cards. See Brandy and Matt in the back. If you have questions, please just shoot your hands up so you can write down your question and pass them back so that when we get to the question and answer portion from the audience, we can get into that. So now let me welcome from Maryland Matters, Mr. Josh Kurtz. Hey, Josh. From the Washington Post, Kyle Swenson. And from the Baltimore Sun, and with our first question, Pamela Wood.
Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for being here. The first question was mentioned in the opening. It's about tenants' access to counsel. In court, landlords typically have legal representation, while tenants rarely have a lawyer on their side. And tenant advocates say that this creates an uneven playing field that hurts renters. The General Assembly did pass legislation expanding the right to counsel for certain low-income tenants, but they did not get legislation fully passed that would have provided for a permanent funding source to pay for these lawyers. So the question is, first, do you agree that it's good public policy to provide lawyers for tenants in rent court? If not, why not? And if so, how would you pay for that?
And I should have said this before you asked your question, so you get extra time to think about your answer. Each candidate is going to get 2 minutes to respond to questions. I'm going to try to do this equitably. And then if there are any additional comments that you might want to make after the question, each panelist might be able to do that once per question and for 1 minute or less. So between myself and the watch, we'll try to keep you on time. So since we started introductions with Mr. Franchot, we'll start the answers with Mr. Perez and work our way down. That's all right.
In my opening remarks, I said sustained executive leadership. The question you asked can be solved right now in the short run through sustained executive leadership. Governor Hogan, with a stroke of a pen, can take the ERAP money. This is the eviction rental assistance program. He can take the money that is existing now and use a portion of it to guarantee a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. Delegate Wilkins and others worked heroically to do what needs to be done. But right now we have an emergency, and this governor can solve that emergency through the stroke of a pen. And that is what I would do if I were governor right now. In addition to the foreclosure moratorium, I would make sure that there was right to counsel. I would also make sure that we put in place measures that result in eviction diversion. There's so many things that other states are doing to prevent that. The General Assembly last year passed a 10-day rule, so now landlords have to give 10 days notice before you can be evicted. But there's so many other things that can and should be done. I look at Virginia and what they have done in the eviction prevention process. Sustained executive leadership could solve this problem, but the governor has been totally hands-off on this, and that is why there are so many people who are about to get evicted. So step one is, the answer to your question is absolutely yes. People should have the right to counsel, because after all, if you get evicted, that has a whole set of adverse consequences. And step two, let's make sure this governor right now, with a stroke of a pen, ensures that these funds are available to guarantee the right to counsel right now. We don't need to wait till next year. We don't need to wait till the next session. We can do it right now. So damn it, let's do it right now, because this is a crisis.
We absolutely should have the right to counsel, and we absolutely need to make sure that it's funded and paid for. See, this becomes part of the thing that we have to make sure that we are getting done when it comes to the policies we're pushing forward, because it's absolutely true. You know, leaders, real leaders, like Delegate Wilkins, who push forward this type of legislation to make sure that people can have proper representation. And frankly, it's proper representation in the way that the landlords do. Because if you look at the way the cases work, over 96% of landlords will have legal representation in eviction cases. For the people who are getting evicted, the tenants, it's 1%. But we know that if you provide legal counsel to people who are going through the eviction processes, that number shifts, and people who then are relieved of that challenge becomes 94%. This is about fairness. This is about equity. And I know this not simply because that it's the right thing to do. I know it's because this is what we've done. In addition to running a successful business in Maryland, where we help to focus on first generation and first family students, make it to and through college, I also ran one of the largest nonprofits in this country with an exclusive focus on ending poverty. And one of the things we fought for and we advocated for and pushed for and got done was actually pushing together a right to counsel, knowing that people should have the right to have counsel when they're going through the eviction court process. It is the just thing to do, and it is the right thing to do, not just in this moment, but it's something that we should have been leading on long before as well.
Look, I think it's right that the governor should deploy federal funds to provide the right to counsel and fund the right to counsel now, but there was a bill that we support at Strong Future Maryland, the progressive advocacy organization that I founded last session, that would have dealt with this. Brian Frosch, the Attorney General, proposed that we raise the eviction fee in Maryland, which is absurdly low. Our eviction fee in Maryland is like $15. The national average is something like $120. Brian Frosch proposed raising the eviction fee and using those funds to fund the right to counsel. It would also have had the benefit of discouraging landlords, particularly landlords for large properties, using eviction as a strategy, basically filing for eviction almost immediately after rent is missed. Right? So there is a proposal. So again, governor should take action immediately. When the legislature is back in session, they should pass the bill that was proposed by Attorney General Frosch. If that doesn't happen this session, I look forward to signing that bill as governor.
So short answer is obviously, absolutely. Renters should have the right to counsel. I think that makes sense. But what I like to do is kind of share my perspective about the issue of housing in general. When I served as one of President Obama's White House liaisons at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, I helped build a team that worked on affordable housing. We also implemented the National Housing Trust Fund, which provided Maryland about $3 million to help with low-income rental assistance and other programs, as you know, like right to counsel. And so with that, what I also saw is there's often a false narrative that what's good for the landlord must be bad for the tenant and vice versa. The reality is both can benefit if we look at the issue in a comprehensive way. And that's why in my housing plan, it's 3 parts. Number 1 is increasing the affordability of housing. Number 2 is increasing the availability of housing. And number 3 is increasing the sustainability of housing. When it comes to the affordability of housing, I talk about providing immediate relief. I talk about expanding our MPDU program. And I also talk about dedicated funding for nonprofits who are already doing a lot of great work. When I talk about the availability of housing, I talk about smart growth, because these are all issues that are tied together to housing. I also talk about making sure that landlords are not prohibiting people from applying and signing leases based on their source of income. And when I talk about sustainability, I talk about increasing the eviction filing fees. I talk about, obviously, the right to counsel and just cause protections. And then also supporting my Maryland Now plan, which will increase disposable income in people's pockets so they can pay their bills on time and have access to good-paying jobs.
So as the person up here who's actually done some of these issues, the devil's in the details. We actually do need, your question, Pam, was about long-term. And obviously in the short term, there's money available. We need to get it to people. And this administration has been woefully inefficient and ineffective in all procurement issues, but we're on the housing and the right to counsel right now. So the money needs to go in the short term. But in the long term, what we did when we did the National Mortgage Foreclosure Settlement was we were focused on the 42 pages of servicing standards going forward. And we hope to never have that issue again. Obviously, right now we're in COVID. We're coming out of COVID slowly, unfortunately. But ultimately, in the long term, what are we going to do about right to counsel for tenants? Delegate Wilkins and Delegate Fisher actually had a wonderful bill that was mentioned earlier, didn't go far enough. We need reverse Gideon in this state, and ultimately we'll get it, and we ought to have it now. But in the meantime, we have legal aid, and that it can help folks solve these tenant issues. But I think actually Mr. Jain hit it right. You know, when you have, and you see this as being a lawyer, when both sides have counsel, you're more likely to come to a satisfactory resolution for both sides. And so we need to make sure that tenants do have counsel going forward, whether it's reverse Gideon or something short of that, and make sure that poor people have the same access to justice as rich people. And that's what this issue actually is all about on the eviction side. We went after robo-signers. I don't remember that. There were literally machines kicking people out of their homes, and we prosecuted those people. And things like that can never happen again, should not happen again because of the servicing standards. And I'm looking forward to making sure when I'm governor that tenants have the right to counsel.
Yeah, no, I as the state's chief fiscal officer, I am acutely aware that a third of our state right now is mired in a depression that is worse than the 1930s. These are our low-wage earners, not us who are sitting up here, or you guys, some of you out there in the audience. These are people that don't have any money. who have been laid off due to no fault of their own. So with all due respect, Pam, I love your, are we going to be able to pass something through the legislature? No, right now we need to act. It is a moral imperative. And therefore, I'm going to be convening on Thursday, day after tomorrow, a private meeting of many of the stakeholders in the tenant advocacy world, along with their counterparts in the landlord world. Because I want to ask the landlords, gentlemen and ladies, we have $750 million in federal money, free money, that's going to be returned to the federal government if we don't give it to you to pay for past unpaid rent. And we're going to come to the, we're going to, I think, develop some interesting ideas as far as how to deal immediately with this crisis. You know, God bless the legislature. And the governor has been asked over and over again, rather than throwing our hands up in the air and saying, well, let's go into the next session. With all due respect, Pam, these hundreds of thousands of low-wage earners who are facing eviction could care less about what the legislature's doing and what might be done down the road. They could care less, frankly, about most of the stuff we're talking about this evening, much as we all agree on things that might prevent this down the road. What they're worried about is they're not going to have a home.
Thank you, Mr. Franchot.
Thank you.
Fantastic. At the risk of being on time, anyone have a follow-up comment that they want to make?
Well, again, it's just important to increase the aperture of your question. You're asking about right to counsel, and what we're not doing well enough, notwithstanding the best efforts of the legislature, is eviction diversion as well. Let's prevent folks from getting to court to begin with. According to the Eviction Lab, we are 29th in the country in eviction protections. That is mediocre at best. And there are so many things we can learn from other states, and they're not rocket science, but they protect people. They avoid the foreclosure, the eviction process to begin with. That's what we also need to focus on. It needs to be holistic. And we can do this, but we don't have a leader in Annapolis who is supporting this effort.
Just add quickly that the courts could also be helpful here. The courts could basically say to landlords who come to evict somebody, you can't, we won't move forward unless you demonstrate that you've
John,
applied for the federal funds.
Thank you for saying that, because every time I say that to our lawyers, they say, oh, you can't do that, you know, that separation of powers, and they don't have the legal thing. We need to do something now. That's why everybody, I think, needs to unite around some of the renters, some of your alliance positions. Obviously, we're all in favor of eviction diversion. And Tom, thank you for saying that. We're all in favor of the reforms that will prevent this from happening in the future. The question is, what are we going to do now? There are 800 evictions pending. There are 4,000 other evictions about to be filed. There are 33,000 non-payment of rental filings that have been made. These hundreds of thousands of low-wage earners are going to be ground under the system that we have, that Doug and others have mentioned. So we've got to do something now. Well, I'll let you know what happens in this Thursday meeting. It's a private meeting because we want to have people really get down to something that could actually work and convince the landlords that this money needs to be given to them,
Thank you,
but
Mr.
they need to
Franchot.
stop these evictions.
Yeah, I'd like just to follow up quickly on Tom's point, because I think it's a very important one, which is the eviction diversion. One of the things we did do in the National Mortgage Foreclosure Settlement was give millions and millions of dollars, almost $40 million here in Maryland, to housing counselors. Because if you're being evicted by your landlord, you're not going to take on one of the big banks by yourself. And to go to having access to housing counselors and putting some of the money into that in the long term will allow folks to have the housing counselors, tell them different programs, tell the tenant different programs that are available to them to hopefully ameliorate their financial issue, but also have them work with the banks on their behalf to keep them in their homes. So I think that's a very important issue that Tom raised.
Fantastic. Mr. Moore. Thank you very much. Very generous. All right, so we'll thank you very much. We're off to a good start. I'll move on to Mr. Kurtz.
Thanks, Will. We've got a room full of renters here, and so I think it would be relevant to ask you all, I'm assuming you're all homeowners, but maybe not. Assuming you are all homeowners, when were you last a renter? And what was that experience like? And did you or members of your family ever face an eviction?
That's a great question. So we're going to start at this end, and we're going to work our way toward the middle. So we'll start with Mr. Franchot. That's right.
Starting with me?
Yes.
Yes, when I started out in the United States Army and then came out and was an environmental grassroots organizer, and I rented, obviously. I had no way to own anything, but I ended up coming down and working in Washington for Congressman Ed Markey, now a U.S. Senator. And my wife and I, we've been married 41 years. Annie's here, thank God, just to make sure I don't faint up here or something. And but you know, we rented down on Ed Markey. I was his staff director, so we had enough money to rent on Capitol Hill. We were never in danger of eviction. But do I feel a moral? And we own a house now, and et cetera, so it's not. That's not something that affects us. But I started out by saying I am totally focused on these. 1/3 of the entire state is mired in a dire recession. It hasn't changed. When I drove up here, when I was driven up here, I passed the Tacoma Park Food Co-op. There were 150 people waiting for a free box of food. Come on. I mean, this is something that's happening right in front of us. So the idea that we can go back to the normal advocacy, I think, is over. I thought that the suggestion that Mr. King had, that we, you know, I'm going to ask the judiciary to take a look at this, but somebody's got to do something right now.
Thank you, Mr.
Slow down
Franchot.
the eviction.
I'll have to
slow
stop
down
you
the
there.
evictions enough just to give
Thanks so
us
much.
time to reimburse these landlords.
Thanks so much. Mr. Gansler.
I rent my home. I get the newspaper every day, the real one. You actually read it. And I've never been evicted. Probably come close, but not for financial reasons. And college was a hell of a good time. No, no, seriously, never been evicted. But you know, I've worked with people that have been evicted my whole life. In fact, it's interesting. I wrote my college thesis on the right for the homeless to vote. And it was a fascinating experience for me because I had not rented or been homeless before college. And speaking to homeless people and hearing their thoughts and concerns and issues and learning at a very young, impressionable age, 40 years ago, really has had a lasting effect on me. And so these have been issues that I've been dealing with in my 23 years in government service, and I look forward to doing more in the future as governor.
Thank you.
So I'll have a different perspective to bring. I'm a proud son of Indian American immigrants. I have always lived in a multi-generational house with my grandmother, my parents, my sister, and we all take care of each other. But I do remember growing up in our 2-bedroom apartment, seeing my parents struggle to pay the rent. We had conversations daily, at least my sister and I overheard those conversations, just about how are we going to pay our bills? And on top of that, my parents were struggling with the language barrier because they're immigrants from India. So it was tough for them to find work. They started their own business, and as any entrepreneur knows, it's really hard to get things going and support your family. And so that really grounded a lot of the work I've done in my life over the past 2 decades, working in the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and it really stays true to the policies that I have and the whole reason why I'm running for governor in the first place, which is to make this entire process more inclusive and more accessible for everyone. And in terms of my campaign operation, which again ties into the question, we have people who are renters on our team. We are a 100% volunteer-run campaign from every single part of the county. And so having all these different lived experiences, I think, is really important for the governor to have, for the governor's team to have, and how we're going to execute these policies in the most inclusive manner possible.
Thank you.
when I was a teacher and a principal, I was a renter. It wasn't really until I went into state government that I was finally able to buy a home. And what I think about is we got to make it so that people can have affordable housing at every income level if we're serious about the idea that housing is a human right. And that means we've got to make sure we have the supply of affordable housing that we need. We have to grapple with the fact that one of the reasons we don't have the supply of affordable housing that we need is a history of racial segregation, of redlining, of policies at the local, state, and federal level that were designed to make housing an exclusive commodity rather than to vindicate it as a human right. And we have to make the changes in state policy that will make that possible. We have to make it easier to build multifamily units. We have to rethink zoning. We have to make it easier for folks to get capital to build affordable housing. That's why we should have a state bank that could help make that possible. And we have to make it possible for folks to get assistance with down payments and the process of becoming homeowners. Those are all achievable in Maryland. It's a question of political will.
I really appreciate the question because the home that I was actually born in is not too far away from here. It was a place that I actually, as my mom would say, she had, who's actually sitting right there, who she said some of my greatest and some of my most traumatic memories happened in that home. It was the home that when I was 4 years old, I watched my father die in front of me. I watched how my mother did not get her first job that gave her benefits until I was 14 years old. When we're talking about the importance of addressing housing, this is an overarching challenge because if we are going to focus on creating real economic pathways for people, it must start with a stable home. It must start with our ability to be able to have people in a place where they feel secure, in a place where they feel cherished, in a community where that home is respected. And it also must also mean that as we're thinking about our future-facing policies for all of these things, and these policies, these are right policies that we're all going to back in advance. But it does mean being able to have a chief executive who understands its importance and who is going to prioritize it. And the fact that so much of this burden right now is falling on local jurisdictions. And the local jurisdictions, while it's important to empower our local jurisdictions and our local leaders, that does not mean removing the responsibility for the state to take leadership. So this is very personal to me and to my family that we can get this right. And I know it is for so many of you who are growing up in the neighborhoods and the neighborhoods in which you grew up in that is right now completely unaffordable. We can do better. And that's why this is a major priority of how the Moore administration is going to move forward on this.
When we first moved to Maryland, we rented, my wife and I. And when I was in school, I was looking to rent an apartment in the Boston area. And I called the landlord. And the landlord asked me a series of questions, such as, where are you from? Perez. Where's that from? I didn't get the apartment. By the way, my roommate's name was O'Brien. I should have said I was O'Brien because I would have gotten the apartment. Here's what I learned from that. Because one of my first jobs at the Justice Department was in the housing section. That was the first summer that I worked there. And when I had the privilege of leading the Civil Rights Division, one of the things we put in place, we took it to scale, was a testing program. Because you know what? Evictions touch everyone, but they disproportionately touch communities of color. And you know what? Getting into the apartment to begin with and being unable to do so because of the color of your skin or your accent or some other discriminatory factor is a big deal. So we put in place match-paired testers that would go in and uncover discrimination. We need to do that at scale at a state level so that we can root out discrimination at the front end, as well as protecting people from eviction. We need to make sure that we don't have source of payment discrimination, and I applaud the state legislature for doing that. And what we need to do right now is make sure that people understand that new rule, because I am certain that is still going on. And what we must always remember in this context is that but for the grace of God could go any of us. My wife works at a place called the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. She works with people experiencing homelessness every single day. I led the Interagency Council on Homelessness when I was your labor secretary. I saw so many people who were doing everything right, but something happened. They had a mental health crisis, or they lost a loved one. And we need to make sure here that we have their back. And right now, we're just not doing it. We don't have the sustained executive leadership, and we don't have a governor who's really cared about this.
Thank you.
And that's what we need to change.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up responses from any of you? Thank you.
Could I just add in, because, I hate to be a broken record, but the problem right now facing us is a moral one. It's an imperative. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are facing eviction. And I appreciate the question from Josh. I think it probably illuminates about us individually, but we need to focus on getting them some relief right now. Is the ultimate goal home ownership? Sure. Black and brown families are in the low 40s as far as home ownership. That's the only path to the middle class. White families are up above 70%. We need to have parity. We need home ownership as a path to the middle class. But my goodness, we're talking about replacing redlining with greenlining. I'm all for that, and we're going to do that. But that concept is going to take years to implement. So please keep your focus on these folks that are all around us who are about to get crushed. And thank you for letting me add something to it. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Moderator.
I was just saying, and I'll add, I think that's exactly right. We cannot forget about the immediate crisis that's taking place right now. We also cannot forget about why the immediate crisis is taking place right now. We can't forget about the fact that we have years of challenges, and this is actually a very unique moment where we actually can make a generational change to our generational challenges. The irony is, for many things that we're speaking about right now, you could actually have this conversation 10 and 15 and 20 years ago and be having the same conversations about housing insecurity, about economic disparities, about the impact that this is having exclusively and specifically on communities of color and on women. That's not a new phenomenon. So yes, we have to address the immediate. We have to address the immediate with the fact that we have immediate resources that you're absolutely right. We have to put in place, and we have to deploy, and we have to deploy equitably, and we need the state to be able to take on a leadership role to support our local jurisdictions to do so, and at the same time, being able to think about the long-term causes and challenges, because the number one driver of pushing people into poverty continues to be eviction. We can stop that. There's no reason for a single eviction to take place in the state of Maryland.
Especially when there's $750 million sitting in the state bank accounts. I mean,
Thank you so much,
am I
Mr. Franchot.
delusional, or is this like a once-in-a-generation opportunity?
You're certainly not delusional. Mr. Franchot? Sorry, Mr. Perez.
Well, thank you for that compliment. When I was at the Justice Department, we put a real emphasis on fair lending, and we created a fair lending task force. One of the things we have to do here in Maryland, and this is something that I remember talking to Delegate Wilkins about. We need someone in the Department of Housing and Community Development who's spending their entire day thinking about renters. Renters, renters, renters. That's what we need to do. The unemployment insurance crisis has illustrated the incompetence of the administration there, and we need folks to step up here. So if I have the privilege of becoming your governor, we're going to do something like that. We're going to make sure we are reinventing government, because a third of our people in this state are renters. Let's make sure they have a voice at the state level that's a really muscular, innovative voice. I don't think that's there right now, and I mean no disrespect to the dedicated career folks there, but they aren't getting a lot of direction and help from above.
Yeah, if I could, I'd just add, I think Tom's right, and the one thing was of interest to me is not only do we have a third of our folks are renters, but I recall when I became state's attorney in Montgomery County, someone said to me, we should have a residency requirement. This is a huge county. Everybody who works in the state's attorney's office works for the county ought to live in the county. So I floated that idea around the office, and in particular the support staff went up in arms, and they said, we can't afford to live in Montgomery County. And so they all lived in Frederick, and by the way, now you can't live in Frederick, so you have to live in Washington County. But at the time, it was Montgomery County. So yes, renters have to be have to have the attention of the state government for sure. But there ought to be a choice for folks if they want to rent or live in an affordable house and have affordable housing. And we have to really focus also on making sure we have more affordable housing in every zip code in the state of Maryland and here in Montgomery County.
Just want to push us to be clear in the conversation about what we're willing to commit to as governor. Because one of my fears is if this campaign is waged in generalities and not in specifics, we will not have a clear mandate to act. Just cause eviction law? Yes or no? If yes, then say it in the campaign and let's campaign on that. Raising the eviction fee as the Attorney General has proposed. Is that uncomfortable for some landlords who resist raising the eviction fee? Sure. But if we campaign on it, then we have a mandate to do it, and we can take the eviction fee from $15 up closer to the national average of $120. If we believe in inclusionary zoning, let's commit to it. Let's say the state is going to lead on inclusionary zoning and say that we can build duplexes and triplexes and townhomes, at least in close proximity to public transit hubs. Let's commit to those things so that we have the momentum to actually get them done, starting with the first session for a new governor.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I like it. I like the energy. We're going to hop to another question. So Mr. Swenson.
Good evening, everyone. This has been alluded to before in this conversation, but there has been a lack of urgency in the implementation of the federal rent relief program. And to kind of throw some kind of hard numbers at that, according to the Treasury Department, as of July 30th, Maryland had spent, in its first round of ERAP, it's $401 million. In the first round, it had only spent about $57.9 million. And for renters and also for landlords, every day counts in this. Now that slowdown has often happened at the local government level. To be fair to local governments, they've been asked to basically fly the plane while building it, implement a program that's never been before implemented. But at the same time, if you had been governor during this period, what could you have done and what should you have done, or what could you have done to step on the gas, so to speak, and accelerate the process? Because again, every day that goes by with that money not getting in the pockets of landlords and tenants is a missed opportunity and an increase in their suffering and pain.
So as we continue to work our way into the middle, we'll start with Mr. Gansler, go over. So,
me?
yes, and go over. And a reminder to folks in the audience to be jotting down those questions and pass them back to our volunteers.
Yeah, I mean, if the average person actually knew that all that money was being wasted, and it just would be anathema to common sense. Like,
It was in the newspaper.
I understand, but I'm one of the few that still gets the newspaper. If you don't get it, you don't get it. You might know that. And so but it's an amazing thing. And the ineffectiveness and inefficiencies of this administration cannot be overstated. And so a number of things. One, it really goes to the importance of having somebody as governor who's actually been in government and understands how the levers of government work, who knows the counties in Maryland, who's been and worked with the leaders in these counties and have worked with the both local, county, and state governments to make sure that things run effectively and efficiently. See, governor should not be a starter job in government. And so I think that's critical. I think the second thing that is critical is that we have to have a Democrat, because the federal government is being run by Democrats, and our state needs to have a Democratic governor. So while we are all basically going to say the same things all night, because these are all very, very good people and very accomplished people, and we have the same tenets and beliefs, we have to have somebody that can actually win and become not win the primary, but also win the general election in an incredibly Republican year that's coming up. So in order to get monies from the federal government to effectively and efficiently be disseminated in local levels, you have to be able to work with the federal government. I served with Kamala Harris for 4 years as Attorney General. My closest friend as Attorney General was Beau Biden, so I got to know Joe Biden and many, many people in the administration. So that's the kind of thing that we need to have going forward.
Mr. Jain.
So I think the first simplest answer is really having a passionate advocate as governor, someone who not only understands how to create policy, but also have the perspective and empathy to enforce those policies in an equitable way, and really leading a campaign that includes more residents in the decision-making process from day one of the campaign, not just when you're elected. So that's number one. Number two is looking at the issue really in a comprehensive way. Because if you look at it just in piecemeal, you're not going to be able to really solve this issue. This is not a new issue. It's been going on forever. And so that's why my housing plan has three parts: increasing the affordability of housing, increasing the availability of housing, and increasing the sustainability of housing. So that's everything from making sure that we prohibit discrimination based on source of income. We're making sure we're increasing the eviction filing fees and having just cause protections in place. Making sure that we're allowing folks to have more disposable income by eliminating one of their entire tax, the state income tax. Making sure we're guaranteeing them a job so they have access to a good paying union job. Making sure that we're looking at all of these issues in the short term and long term, and then connecting the issue of housing to transportation infrastructure, to smart growth, to making sure we're tying it into education. All these issues are connected. And I think one of the main reasons why some of these programs don't get implemented in the way we want is because you have leaders that have been in place for decades and are refusing to only, to not look at the solutions in the long term as well.
Thanks so much. Mr. King.
Governor Hogan plays moderate on TV on Sundays, but has governed in a way that reflects his vote in the last presidential election for Ronald Reagan. I'm talking about this past 2020 election for Ronald Reagan. It's an approach that has shrunk our government. We have thousands of open positions in state government, and the state has not been as effective a partner as it should be with the counties in dealing with the entirety of the COVID crisis. The housing piece is the latest representation of that. There are other states that are doing better than Maryland in getting the aid out. There are places in Maryland that are doing better than others. The role of the state should be to learn best practices from other states, to lift up best practices in counties. For example, Baltimore City has a project with United Way to help get kind of bulk payment to landlords when they are bulk renters and they have multiple tenants who are at risk of eviction. We should be doing more of that around the state so the dollars get out more quickly. But I don't want to make this seem like it's isolated from a broader pattern. You talk to county executives and they'll tell you they heard about some of the COVID policy changes when they turned on the governor's press conference. That is not the way to govern. We ought to have a governor who governs in partnership with the county executives. That's the kind of governor I'd be.
It is important that we do not put this blame simply on the local jurisdictions. We understand that right now the challenge is that we are looking at the state work as some form of a pass-through. It does not have to be. And we have people who are working on the local level and the county level who are working around the clock to try to make sure that the capital is allocated to the people who need it and the ones who deserve it most. But frankly, they do not have a partner. When we're thinking about what's happening, I think it's not that Governor Hogan does not understand government. It's he's choosing not to act. This is a choice. And so when we think about the things that we need to do, it is about how are we lifting up the good work that's actually happening at the local level, that's taking real leadership on these type of issues, and saying, okay, how do we work in partnership to make sure that this kind of work can scale? How are we looking at the work that's being done right here in Montgomery County around inclusionary zoning? The work that's being done over in Anne Arundel County, when we're looking at the stuff that's being done right now about rental housing works and making sure that we know that that works. Now we just make sure that it's fully funded. So the work that the locals are doing is not just admirable, it is life-saving to try to get this capital out. But it is true, when we're talking about the difference that we see between other states that actually have statewide leadership that's taking a role on it, states like Virginia, where the governor's taking an active role in making sure that that capital is getting pushed out and allocated, we watch markedly different results. And that is what we need.
13 years ago, I was the Secretary of Labor Licensing and Regulation. We were in the middle of the Great Recession. Wall Street had wreaked havoc here. The foreclosure crisis was everywhere. The governor asked me to help lead an effort to pass legislation moving forward. What did we do? We built a big table. We made sure that everyone had a seat at the table. We passed forward-leaning legislation that we were able to pass nearly unanimously because it made a huge difference in people's lives. What should we be doing right now? The exact same thing, sustained executive leadership. What we should be doing right now, and what he didn't do, is convene everyone early, because the guidance should come from the governor. The reason why Virginia is doing so well is because Governor Northam and his team convened fair lending advocates, they convened local governments, they convened landlords, they convened everyone who had skin in the game. They came up with a plan, and actually, as a result of that leadership, all but 2 jurisdictions in Virginia opted to have the state run the program so that you have uniformity. New York State has distributed 100% of their funds. In Colorado, the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, issued an executive order saying if you have applied for assistance, that is an affirmative defense. He was providing guidance. That's what hasn't been done. That's what the unemployment insurance debacle, people 6 months later haven't gotten their UI checks. That's unconscionable. What we need is not only someone with a plan, but someone who has actually done this before. And I've had the privilege, both in the Obama administration and with Martin O'Malley and here in local government, where we confront a lot of challenges here in Montgomery County, of convening people, bringing folks together, and then getting things done. It is unconscionable that by the end of this month, Maryland must obligate 65% of these funds or be at risk of losing them. We're nowhere near 65%. Shame on us. We must change that, and we need sustained executive leadership to get it done.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Please.
It's
Sorry,
impossible.
Mr. Franchot.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm behind the flag.
You're behind
over
the
here.
flag. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Mr. Franchot.
So it's impossible to not concede that competence in state government is the #1 issue in this campaign, because we've suffered so much. Tom mentioned the unemployment situation. We're doing a top-to-bottom review, asked by the legislature, Delegate Wilkins and others, to do this, of all the federal relief funds. Well, we've spent $13.2 billion on unemployment claims. $2 billion of it was sent, my experts estimate, and the work group is working on this, were sent to crooks. They didn't do the kind of fraud detection. Now, does that mean we shouldn't have sent out the others checks? No, of course we should have. But we should have done it competently. Nobody at the Department of Labor apparently picks up the phone. And as Tom said, nobody, frankly, can process a filing for unemployment. Same thing with the rental relief fund, $750 million. It is held up in a kind of pattern of incompetence that results in the very meager allocations that are made. That was first located by the group that I'm heading up as Comptroller to look at all of the $70 billion in federal funds that have come into the state. But this issue, if you don't have competence, you're not going to get confidence and trust from the voters to do big things. You've got to get the little things right. I've done that. We answer 800,000 phone calls a year in the Comptroller's office. 30 seconds, you get a live, friendly voice on the line. We process 3 million tax returns. We put $3 billion in refunds in 2.5 business days back into people's business accounts. We have almost eliminated fraud using algorithms and hiring local companies that help us detect fraud. That's competence in state government. That's what people are looking for. Yes, the leadership, yes, the rhetoric, yes, the charisma, yes, the eloquence. It's incredibly important. The promises, the pledges. But fundamentally, they want the potholes fixed, they want the trash picked up, and they want the gosh darn phones answered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Jain, you have a follow-up? Sure.
Just one thing I wanted to add to this conversation, it's also part of my housing plans, which you can find at jainforgovernor.com, is providing more dedicated funding for nonprofits, like the Renters Alliance. There are already great work being done by a lot of great organizations that struggle for funding every year when the budget cycle comes up. And they're doing the work, they're meeting the people where they are, they're helping with rental assistance, relocation fees, mental counseling, job counseling, and you name it. So instead of duplicating efforts, I think we need a better partner in the governor's office with our nonprofit space and provide that dedicated revenue stream.
Thank you. Mr. Perez.
Go ahead. One other very important stakeholder that needs to be at the table as the governor should be leading are sheriffs. Sheriffs get the list of folks who are about to be evicted. We're in an emergency room situation. We're in a triage situation. We should know every person in this state who is about to get evicted so that we can provide that relief. We can move them to the front of the queue so that doesn't happen. I have serious doubt that this governor has engaged sheriffs in this effort. And I know that there are counties that are doing this, and I applaud them for doing that, but we should have it everywhere. Your geography shouldn't determine your destiny here, and that's happening all too frequently because of the governor's failure of leadership.
I'm willing to, I think all of us should get together and demand that the sheriff show up, the judiciary shows up, the Department of Housing shows up, the counties are there. I mean, this can be figured out. This is not rocket science. The money is there. Other times we have to struggle with, as Pam was asking, how do you pay for something that sounds so good? The money is there. It's not Maryland money, it's federal money. So why don't we all join in, perhaps? It's hard, not that hard, because we agree very largely with each other, and do exactly that. Tom and Wes and John and others, Doug and Mr. Jain. I mean, just ask. I'm going to start it on Thursday with getting the landlords and the tenants together. But maybe we should include the judiciary, the district court judge administrator, the governor's agencies if he doesn't want to involve himself personally, and bring everybody together so that we've got some hope that this money will actually be utilized soon and have a positive influence. I mean, happy to work with you guys on organizing this, because it's just so obvious that the landlords are going to want to be paid, the tenants don't want to be evicted, the state and the local jurisdictions don't want evictions, and the economy is going to suffer. So,
Thank you.
hey, I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Franchot.
I like your suggestion about bringing together different stakeholders
Thank you,
who,
Mr.
without
Franchot.
violating the separation of power,
We're gonna have
can
to move
actually
on,
do
Mr.
something.
Franchot. I'm sorry. Maybe we could work out how to do that together in the break. Mr.
Yeah,
Gansler, go ahead.
if I could just jump in, I think actually the comptroller's onto something. Though judges actually can't come in and fix these issues, we can do what I did here in Montgomery County when I started the first domestic violence dockets and when we started drug court here. In times of emergency like this, you could have dedicated dockets, and this is the judiciary and the court administrators could actually have, say, one day a month. This is what we did when I was Attorney General with natural resources cases, for example, in Anne Arundel County, where you could have eviction day, if you will, and it could be Fridays, and you have a judge that understands the law around evictions. You have housing counselors in the courtroom available for folks that are about to be evicted. Since we don't have civil Gideon, you could have volunteer lawyers from the bar who are doing their service and volunteer to help people that are up there before that judge, and try and actually, again, divert people from being evicted in the first place. And you can bring the judiciary and the court system into the process.
Thank you very much. Any other?
I'm told you can't, so thank God I got my new friend over here, Doug Gansler, who tells me we can, and I think we should. It's a moral responsibility.
I want to make sure that we can get in a couple more questions, but really appreciate the dialogue here. I definitely also want to throw out, speaking of the coordination happening at the county level, the Renters Alliance was actually really involved in bringing to the table just the stakeholders as you talked about, the sheriff's office, county executive, county staff, because we said the same thing, that the information is there, the stakeholders are there, and people need to, if you need someone to bring people together, we said we'll do it, and we did it. And There was a piece in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago, actually, about some of that work that we were doing. So I appreciate that. But I joked about getting together in the break to talk about how we can do that together. But in all seriousness, if we can get your voices together along with the voices of advocates and other organizations, maybe we can break this logjam before we waste the money. So I do want to move on to a couple more questions. I promise lots more time to talk. So really appreciate how we're moving through. So I want to move back to Ms. Wood for her second question.
Okay, well, moving on to a different area, we've heard about the HOME Act tonight. The HOME Act, for those who may not be aware, is a statewide law that was passed a couple years ago to prohibit discrimination against how a prospective tenant pays their rent. So in short, a landlord or a management company can't have a blanket policy against, say, government housing vouchers. That was one of the key problems trying to be solved by that law. As well, many tenants were being funneled into a limited number of neighborhoods because of these landlord bans. So since the HOME Act has been passed, how do you feel the implementation has been? Where do you see rooms for improvement? Or what else needs to be done to help renters, particularly those with government housing assistance?
Fantastic. And we'll start with Mr. Moore and work our way this way.
So I think that we all have seen that, once again, this becomes a policy where we have an implementation that is producing a result that, frankly, we could look before when it was even passed and know that this was not the result that we were aiming for, right? And part of it's because when you have a lack of executive leadership that is going to make sure that we are properly operationalizing, that we're properly funding, and that we're properly enforcing, that all three of those mechanisms need to be in place, that we are going to end up with results that are going to be not just lacking, but incredibly counterproductive for our neighbors and incredibly counterproductive for those citizens that we need, right? This is something where, this is a policy where we know when it comes to the basics of making sure that capital allocation, and we are creating mechanisms for people to be able to be in homes and stay where they are. This is absolutely crucial. When we're looking at the amount of people that are spending 30 and 40 and 50% of income on rent, that we actually have policies that are put in place that are intended to protect people along those lines. But if we are not, as an ARC, if we're not thinking about all the policies that we are implementing, that we're focusing on operationalizing, that we're focusing on funding, and we're focusing on enforcement of those mechanisms, we end up with those type of delays. And we think about it even in terms of how, going back to the conversation about, we think about emergency funds and emergency power. Where if you look at what happened with the emergency eviction moratorium, part of the challenge we had was that we had an eviction moratorium that was lifted because somehow we felt that the conditions on the ground had changed. We're still very much in an emergency situation. And so when we're talking about the people who are going to be most impacted by the HOME Act, the people who are most impacted by these issues, still finding themselves in an emergency situation that, frankly, we have not yet done enough to be able to take them out of the emergency situation. This is where the additional supports and the additional supplements can and should be put in force by the second floor in Annapolis to make sure that these type of implementations and supports for our families and our neighbors can actually be operationalized.
Yeah, I think it's clear that we need better.
Okay.
Going this way?
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you.
It's clear that we need better enforcement, I would say. Also, we need a just cause eviction law so that folks aren't using eviction as a backdoor way to discriminate against tenants. But then we have to tackle the broader issue of whether or not we have adequate supply of affordable housing that is safe and quality. And that's going to require more aggressive leadership on things like inclusionary zoning, things like using a housing trust fund in Maryland. I think since the early 1990s, we've spent maybe $50 million in the Maryland Housing Trust Fund. By comparison, DC, a couple of years ago, spent $180 million. I mean, think about $50 million over a 25-year period, how little investment in a housing trust fund that is. Housing trust fund could be helping to drive the creation of new affordable housing units. We could have a state bank, as I mentioned earlier, that's helping to provide the capital to build mixed income housing. So we have to tackle the supply side alongside enforcement of the Homes Act and a just cause eviction law.
Thanks.
So when I was one of President Obama's White House liaisons at HUD, at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, we saw these kinds of issues pop up many times where there may be a great policy that was passed, but it wasn't enacted or implemented in the best way possible. And specifically to the question of the source of income, we did see a lot of discrimination from landlords who have renters who are using housing vouchers. A lot of times these are seniors residents, these are folks from the disability community, these are LGBTQ youth, trans youth, people who are being discriminated against for many reasons, not to mention the source of income that they have. And so that's where my current housing plan, which talks about increasing affordability, availability, and sustainability of housing, talks about making sure that if a landlord cannot discriminate someone and prohibit them from signing a lease just because of that. And what we're talking about on the campaign trail is, it's not just going to be great to provide more people affordable housing, but it's going to be good for the landlords too, because now they have access to an entire new group of tenants. So again, both can benefit the landlords and the tenants if we look at those issues in a sustainable, comprehensive way.
Yeah, so I think it's a great law that was passed, and I think that we need more of them, because when I started the first civil rights department in Maryland's history, what we saw was the sort of the insidious behind the curtain racism that exists today, and you see it in so many different forms, and what is the source of your income and how you pay your bills is one of those. It's a way, like, it sort of goes back to Mr. Perez and his issue with getting an apartment, and they're looking at other things that they shouldn't be looking at to discriminate, and which is modern day redlining. And so anytime that we can pass laws that prohibit that, we do need to enforce them, and we need to make sure that those are enforced at the county level by the county attorney's office in each county and by the attorney general's office. And that's obviously what we did when I was attorney general. We enforced these kind of laws all the time. And so we need to really promote more legislation that we can, not all these issues can be solved by legislation, but we need to promote more legislation, having a Democratic governor working with a Democratic legislature to pass laws and then to enforce them.
Yeah, no, our housing policies right now are very suspect. We are, for example, on affordable housing. I was in Towson, just north of Baltimore City, last week, there because a number of residents of East Towson said we're tired of the state and the county concentrating poverty in our neighborhood. Every time we turn around, we've got something being imposed on us by developers that has changed the whole residential nature of our community in East Towson, which is a historically African-American neighborhood. So, number one, we have to get that fixed. We have to stop redlining communities. Everybody says, well, redlining's no longer around or it's illegal or something. No, it's alive and well. We need to start greenlining. Someone mentioned setting up a state bank. I would take the untapped debt capacity of the state of Maryland, which is enormous. I've served on the Board of Public Works, and we have a AAA bond rating, but we've deliberately kept the debt level low. Well, we should expand some of that debt level and use it as backing for citizens to get mortgages, be able to purchase homes, which is the North Star. That's the path to the middle class. So I would, all due respect to the home legislation, we have a serious situation in Maryland where, as I mentioned, particularly in brown and black communities, we have a lack of home ownership. And that's not something that's just coming about because of, happenstance. That's coming about because of financial practices. So why don't we pump the money, the resources of the state into these historically damaged communities and increase home ownership? And I think that's the basic thing. I mean, I love to talk about eviction, avoiding evictions, et cetera. That's super important and right in front of us. But long term, home ownership, path to the middle class. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franchot. Mr. Perez.
Your question was, how's the implementation of the HOME Act going? I implemented 2 laws when I served under Martin O'Malley, and I helped get them passed. I mentioned the foreclosure protection laws. We implemented a series of wide-ranging, forward-leaning reforms. And then we also, in the workplace context, passed a series of really important laws on workplace fraud. These are employers who are bidding on contracts and they cheat. And they cheat by misclassifying their workers as independent contractors so they can lowball a bid. And we passed sweeping legislation in both those contexts. How do you make sure those things work? That's a really important question. Step one, you get out there, you work with your partners in the community to educate them. What does the HOME Act mean? What does the HOME Act require? You make sure you are doing relentless outreach and education of all stakeholders. If you don't do that, you will not succeed. Secondly, you make sure that you are beefing up enforcement. Because if you have a sign that says speed limit 40 miles an hour and in parentheses, self-enforcement, people are going to speed. I know that because I've seen that. I know that because that's happening right now because the misclassification, the workplace fraud law we passed under Governor O'Malley, this governor's not enforcing it. And as a result, bad things are happening. So it's really important to do these things. And it's really important. There's so much in governance at a state level and at a federal level and at a local level that's about implementation, effective implementation. If the right folks aren't in the right place with the right leadership and the right enforcement tools and the right approach, it won't get done. We can talk about passing all these laws. They're all good things. But if you don't have a governor who can govern, who's done it, then it's going to be Pyrrhic, these victories. And one of the things I take great pride in is I've done these things. We've implemented laws at a local level and at a state level and at a federal level. And if we're going to give meaning to renters, we've got to reinvent DHCD. We've got to make sure we're enforcing our laws at a state level. We've got to provide more support for our nonprofit partners. We've got to make sure we're doing all of these things. And then and only then will we be in a position to succeed. Because one thing I've learned, laws are only as good as the political will of people enforcing them. And if we have solid folks in these agencies who are committed to this and we give them the resources they need, that's how we can build sustainable enforcement. And that's how we help all the people that we all have a shared interest in helping.
Thanks so much, Mr. Perez. We are moving toward a quick break after a couple more questions, but do want to invite you all if you have quick follow-ups to.
Yeah, I would just follow up on Tom's point because I think it's a good one. And when that was passed, the misclassification bill was passed, the enforcement was literally 3 people. To go, 3 people, there were 3 inspectors in the state that would go to workplaces to identify whether or not there was misclassification going on. And so when I started the first labor council in the state, which General Frosch is continuing, labor was like, this is a great law. We love the law. We have 3 people for the entire state of Maryland to enforce it. So the builders would say, well, it's a cost of doing business. Once a year, maybe someone's going to come by my work site. So to Tom's point, you need people that have done this and understand how effective it is, but you have to put people in positions of power that actually care about those laws. And today we don't have that. This administration clearly doesn't care about renters, doesn't care about fair housing, doesn't care about the Housing Act, and doesn't care about discrimination so much. And so I think that's what makes it even more important to elect a Democratic governor.
Thanks so much, Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll go to Mr. Franchot.
Great, thank you. And I think it's an important point about both having the experience of understanding these issues from a professional and also from a personal perspective, and it is about how are we building the right coalitions and the right teams to actually actualize these things, right? I mean, I think about it in context, whether it was the work that I did when I was running one of the largest nonprofits in this country, where we allocated over $30 million, but just exclusively towards housing security, ending discrimination, focusing on and using the policy realm to be able to focus on things like the right to counsel. But it wasn't just about making sure that we could advocate and get the laws passed. It was about how are we building the coalitions early to make sure that there were the right mechanisms of accountability when things broke down. The challenge that we have for so many people and why people feel so disengaged is because we have seen this over and over and over again. And you're absolutely right that as we think about what we need in the future, what we need to do when we're putting together our policies that are actually going to work for people in the future, it is about how we're not just putting together the frameworks and the policies around these issues, but what are we doing to create everything from DSCD to all up and down the government, from the cabinet to the agency heads, the accountability measures from Jump Street, so that people can gain a greater sense of trust and a greater sense of hopefulness that these things that are being passed are actually going to work in their own lives.
Thanks so much, Mr.
Just
Franchot.
quickly, I've been in elected office 35 years. I've served under 3 Democratic governors, 2 Republican governors. They all have problems implementing. Now, obviously, they disagree, and I don't agree with Hogan on a lot of stuff, but all of these governors have difficulty having concrete, deliverable results that improve people's quality of life. And I promise you that based on my record as Comptroller over the last 14 years, you're going to get somebody who is actually able to implement and execute as far as the improvements that we need in our state. I'm not saying my opponents won't. I'm sure that they will, but it takes a lot of experience to figure out how to get the potholes fixed, the trash picked up, and the phones answered. Doesn't happen if you just by fiat announce it. You have to strategize, manage, and plan it. I'm glad to hear Wes talk about the private sector because they do that a lot better than the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All righty. We'll move on to Mr. Kurtz for your next question.
Thank you. Some of you have talked a little bit about the lack of affordable housing in the state already, and I think all of us would like to hear more about your policy prescriptions for addressing the crisis. 2 things that I'm interested in particular is the question of, can we build our way out of the affordability crisis? And then I'm also interested in finding out whether any of you support a state rent stabilization law.
Fantastic questions. So we will start, the audience really likes those questions. So we will start with Mr. Jain, and we'll work our way this way back around.
All right, I'm going to tackle your second question first about rent stabilization. Short answer, yes. I think rent stability, rent control is really important in terms of providing people a sustainable way of paying their bills, knowing what bills are going to come up. The only exception is we can only do that if we're not raising property taxes. So again, it's a comprehensive issue, but short answer is yes. In terms of my affordable housing plans, I've mentioned earlier, it has to be looked at in a comprehensive way, short-term and long-term. That's why I talk about affordability of housing, availability of housing, and sustainability of housing. Part of those plans, expanding our MPDU program, making sure that we have the moderately priced dwelling unit program. Based on the county that you live in, it's anywhere from 10 to 20% are considered affordable. So part of my plan is to implement a minimum of 15% across the board, making sure that we have things like smart growth, looking at mixed-use development in all of our master plans, building closer to areas of transit, making sure that transit is free and guaranteed to be free for every resident, making sure we're not just looking at single-family homes, but multifamily homes and higher density. So again, you have to tackle these issues in a really comprehensive way, and I think I've addressed some of those ways to do that.
Look, we don't have enough housing, and therefore we don't have enough affordable housing. So building has to be a part of our strategy. We have to have an ambitious plan for increasing the supply of housing. Part of that is changing our approach to zoning. If we only do that at the local level, we will not get far enough. When you ask people generally, they say, yes, we need more housing. But then when you say, what about this project on your block, you get a lot more hesitation. And the truth is, we need state leadership on inclusionary zoning. We need it so we have the supply of housing we also need it so that we're not all underwater because of climate change. At the end of the day, we need a strategy that also allows us to have greater density around public transit if we want to take climate action. So, inclusionary zoning is one. More money in the housing trust is two, so that the state can contribute to the building of the housing that we need. The state bank that I talked about is another vehicle to help developers be able to build affordable, mixed income housing. We also need, as a state, to put in place much stronger tenant protections as a part of how we address housing supply. We've got to tackle all of the buildings that are abandoned. We have many parts of the state, and you see this particularly in Baltimore City, where there are many homes that are abandoned. We ought to be investing in the redevelopment of those homes. The state bank would help with that. But we've got to have an ambitious strategy that matches our housing supply to the demand. Otherwise, people aren't going to be able to afford to live where they grew up. And people aren't going to be able to afford to live in places where it's convenient to travel to work, and that's going to exacerbate our climate problems. So we need an ambitious vision here, and that's what I'd offer.
And there are things that we also can do where we can include and double down on what's working right now and what's also working locally. So, for example, I'm looking at and I see Councilman Will Jawando. Something that we can do immediately when we're talking about, the pandemic era limits on the rent increases that Councilman Jawando has been pushing forward, and I'm very proud to have received Councilman Jawando's endorsement in this governor's race. We can think about how exactly can we as partners, as a state partner, work with our local governments to be able to understand that as we're watching this level of rapid rise, particularly at the most, not just inopportune, but the most inhumane time that we've seen within our state's history, that the state can do a better job, and the state can actually take leadership and work in partnership with our local jurisdictions to make sure that these type of issues that Councilman Jawando was pushing, that we can actually push that across the state. When it comes to the idea of housing, and there's three basic tenets that we have to make sure we're doing. One is we're working on preserving the inventory that we have currently now. The second is how we're thinking about the idea of production and the new housing. John is right. We do not have enough when you're looking at the demand that we have. However, both of those two things must happen with the core and the clear distinction of protecting tenants. Protection of tenants must be the number one variable, the number one element that our chief executive has to think about when it comes to conversations around preservation and it comes around conversations around production. The protection of tenants must be first and foremost in our minds.
In order to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, bless you, in order to rent a bless all of you, I don't want to single you out. In the state of Maryland, you need to be making something like $29 an hour. $29 an hour. That's almost $60,000 a year. So point number one I would make as your former labor secretary, who also had the good fortune of working on a lot of housing issues here at a local level and a state level, is there's an inescapable web of mutuality here. We need to grow good middle-class jobs. That's why I spend so much time talking about offshore wind, which are remarkable good union jobs that we can create. So understanding that, again, think about it, $29 an hour basically is what you need to rent an apartment. We need to understand that this is an issue that affects people who are living in abject poverty, and it affects people who are what we would describe as middle class. I met firefighters on the Montgomery County Council when I was here who were commuting from New Jersey, folks, because they couldn't afford to live here. And so we need to understand the wide range of things that we need to do. I'm very proud of the MPDU program, and when I served on the council, I was part of an overhaul of that program. And one of the things we did is we eliminated the so-called buyout. It was a kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card for developers. You just pay money into a fund, and you didn't have to build. And we thought that was wrong. And so when I was on the council, we reformed that. Now, one of the important principles of affordable housing reform here is that we've got to make sure that local governments are at the table. Because I am very proud of our MPDU program here in Montgomery County. It is literally one of the best in the nation, not just in the state. But at the same time, I would want to talk to county commissioners in every single county to understand the impact of that, because I would absolutely want to replicate it if possible. But I want to make sure I understand what's going on in those counties. And then finally, I know we got a lot to go on here, but I was in Sykesville recently, and I saw a state-owned parcel that had been redeveloped into a mixed-income housing development. There is so much state-owned property here, folks. And a big part of what drives up the cost of housing in this state is the cost of land. We're a landowner, the state of Maryland. Let's figure out how we can use these surplus properties to really address this critically important issue. There is no one magic bullet, and this challenge predated
Thank you.
the pandemic, and we need to understand that.
Thank you so much. Ms. Franchot.
Yes. Last week I was meeting in Prince George's County with a wonderful elected official, African-American woman. She described to me the experience of her youth. She lived with her mother 5 days a week in Columbia, Maryland, Howard County. But her parents were divorced, and her father was didn't have a steady employment as her mother. He lived in West Baltimore. So she said, I would spend 5 days, weekdays, going to school in Howard County, and then I would spend the weekends with my father. She said it was like two different universes. One was a universe of opportunity, my 5 days in Howard County. 2 days with my dad, much as I loved him, was the opposite. So what I think she was describing, and she actually was pretty emotional over it, was that your zip code is your destiny. And right now we are increasing the concentration of poverty in areas. I mean, in Baltimore City, the appraisals are rock bottom. There's no value in abandoned homes. So, yeah, as we're tonight dealing with a lot more housing situations being necessary to create because so many people are going to be evicted if we don't step in. But as far as the housing policy of my administration, we're going to dedicate a tremendous amount of effort to reversing the history of redlining and replacing it with greenlining and putting affordable housing and opportunities for low-wage earners to live in the so-called opportunity zones. Opportunity to, like this young woman described in Howard County. So, that's going to require a lot of partnership with the banks. It's going to require a lot of financial and statutory and regulatory authority from the state. But it has to happen. We can't continue year after year to tolerate what we have right now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Mr. Gansler.
To be governor, you have to deal with the crisis as it comes up, but you also have to have a long-term vision. So when I was state's attorney, we had the Beltway snipers, and I dealt with that crisis, fixed it, and moved on and worked on criminal justice reform. When gay people were denied the right to marry people that they loved, I led the fight by writing an opinion, had impeachment proceedings against me to make sure that out-of-state same-sex couples were recognized here in Maryland. When we look right now, and of course the mortgage foreclosure crisis was the same thing when we were able to keep people in their homes and not be foreclosed and fight the big banks. And when we look at right now, obviously what we need to do is keep people in their homes. And there's an enormous amount of money sitting there unspent, which we've talked about ad nauseum tonight, which is shocking and stunning, and that would be the first priority. But if you look at the long term, then you have to look at affordable housing differently. And so in the long term, we need more affordable housing here in Montgomery County, one of the most wealthiest counties in the country. But then you look at Baltimore City, where you have, depends on who you ask and what day, 15,000 to 30,000 shells. And how do you fix those up and have people come back in the city? How do you have Baltimore realize the promise of Baltimore that Washington, D.C. has realized in Philadelphia, so people will move back in to affordable housing into the city? Because I guess I respectfully disagree with some of my colleagues up here. I don't think the answer is to build more houses. There's plenty of houses out there. We need to have more affordable houses. And in fact, as the only environmentalist up here on the stage, I would submit things like 2,600. Well, I know a lot of you guys recycle, but and that's great. But you have like 2,600 houses that are going to be built in Trapp, Maryland, and we need to stop sprawl and have smart growth. So yes, we need more housing, in some areas of the state, but we don't need more housing in other areas of the state. We just need someone that cares about affordable housing and has governed before and knows how the levers of government work to get that done.
So I have to say, and definitely going to recognize folks for follow-ups. A couple of you referenced the second part of Josh's question about stabilization, but all of you didn't. So if you want to take an opportunity to do so in your follow-ups, you're welcome to. But Mr. Moore, I see you have a follow-up. So.
Well, and I just have to say, respectfully, inventory is an issue. And inventory is an issue that we repeatedly hear from people actually all around the state. This is not about there is no inventory. The inventory is there for affordable housing. Inventory still is very much an issue. So the way we're going to address it, as was said earlier, both in the short term and the long term, is about how we're focusing on preservation and also how we're focusing on new units that are going to have to come up. When we're talking about opportunity for our families and opportunity for our children, the answer is not going to be let's move them to places that have more opportunities. This is about how are we actually developing the communities in which people live in right now. This is not about having throwaway communities and frankly having a stance that if I want a child to be able to succeed, then they need to leave where they are. No, we need to invest in where they are. We need to invest in all the basic infrastructure needs that are going to need to include housing, but it is also holistically about how are we thinking about transportation and moving people from where they live to where they work? How are we thinking about education and knowing that the anchors of our institution, the anchor of our communities, are our institutions, of our educational institutions? How are we thinking about health facilities so people don't have the opportunity to actually be treated in places that are in their neighborhood and not have to worry about even if I get sick, it's going to take me hours to get there. So this is not about how do we move people to opportunity. This is about how we move opportunity to people.
Can I just say I associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Jain on the stabilization. The devil's in the details. I mean, these are complicated issues, and he mentioned one concern about, for small landlords, property tax increases. And so we just have to look at that and deal with it. But do we need to make affordable housing present in Maryland? Of course we do. But it has to be in the right places. I also associate myself with the urban sprawl concerns of Mr. Gansler. Yeah, that is happening all around the state. But we can figure out how to locate and organize affordable housing and new housing in areas where there is real opportunity. And that's super important, and as we reinvent and recreate and help improve the city of Baltimore. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Mr. King.
Just 2 quick points. One is the principle we should operate on is that rent should be fair and stable. And that requires state leadership. So yes, we should have a statewide approach to rent stabilization. The second point is that we have to see housing as interconnected with other policy areas. And we have to make investments in public transit. By not building the Red Line project in Baltimore City, Governor Hogan set Baltimore back 20, 30, maybe 40 years, right? And so you have to think of, if you want to have the kind of renaissance we should have in Baltimore, you need to build the Red Line project. If you want to have less traffic and more opportunity in Southern Maryland, you have to build the Southern Maryland Light Rail project, right? We have to invest in transit as we invest in housing. We have to incentivize healthcare providers to locate in communities that are today underserved, including Prince George's County, which has a shortage of healthcare specialists, right? So we have to think holistically about how we support healthy communities.
How about a break? Can we do that?
So the only thing standing between us and the break is one more question and how many times you all want to follow up. So if you want to, I see Mr. Perez is about to jump out of your seat.
On that score, I'm standing in the way of us in a break. I don't know that I want to do that.
I appreciate your indulgence and your endurance. So let's go to Mr. Swenson for the final question. We could try to be brief and succinct. If you feel the need to do a follow-up after, I won't jump at you, but you will be standing between you and the break at that point. So, Mr. Swenson, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to return to eviction for a moment because I think, unfortunately, we all recognize that we're bracing for some type of wave of eviction coming. Eviction really, though, doesn't really end when the sheriff knocks on the door. Obviously, for those families, you have this filing against you that follows you around for the rest of your life and really can be a bar to access future housing. Very often, landlords will deny someone with a past eviction filing, even if it didn't result in a physical eviction. Is that fair? And what type of protections need to be in place to make sure that that isn't hanging around tenants' necks down many years down the line?
So we're going to start with Mr. King and loop this way.
I mean, we need far fewer eviction applications in Maryland, and part of how we get there is we raise the fee. And what you have now is landlords who think about eviction as a general collection strategy. A couple days past the day rent is due, they file evictions wholesale. They do that in part because it only costs $15 to file the eviction fee. We have places in the state where there are as many people are filing for as many evictions as there are renters. And so one thing we can do to change that is we can raise the fee for filing for eviction. We can fund the right to counsel, so that makes it less attractive for folks to file for eviction. But we also need to change the underlying economics. We ought to accelerate the effort to raise the minimum wage to at least $15 everywhere in the state. We ought to index the minimum wage to inflation. And we ought to do the things necessary so that people have the economic means to afford their housing. And we have to go after those landlords who are taking advantage of people. And when I was Secretary of Education, one of the things I was struck by, we launched a whole enforcement effort against these for-profit colleges, predatory for-profit colleges. For-profit colleges that would steal from folks who are low income, steal from veterans, take their GI Bill money, give them meaningless degrees or no degree at all. And I was always shocked by how hard people worked to take advantage of other people, how pernicious that was. And that's a lot of what we have happening when you have landlords like a Jared Kushner filing huge numbers of evictions as a way to exploit low-income folks for personal profit.
Thanks so much. Mr. Moore, yeah, we'll do this way. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Mr. Jain.
Am I up?
You're up.
All
Sorry.
right.
Trying to determine which way the wave was going. You're up. You're up.
So this is, as I mentioned earlier, part of my increasing the sustainability of housing. Not only increasing the eviction filing fee, not only, we're $15, as was mentioned earlier. The national average is $120. We have to meet that to make it a little harder to evict someone. We have to have just cause protections to make sure that a landlord is required to provide you a notice, a reasoning, and at least some sort of effort to remedy the issue before going straight to evictions. And again, not only is that going to help more people stay in homes and housing, but it's going to be better for the economy and better for the community as a whole. And then the final piece that I talk about is my Maryland Now plan. Making sure that we have more disposable income in people's pockets. Making sure that if you are struggling to find work, you are guaranteed to find a job, a good paying job. Making sure that your cost of living is reduced by, for example, offering free public transit for every resident in our state. So I think, again, you have to look at the issue in a comprehensive way, look at not only the systems in place, but at the end of the day, making sure people have more disposable income and more opportunities for self-growth.
Thanks so much.
So to answer your question, and to follow up on Mr. King's point, when I prosecuted those for-profit institutions that took advantage of those people, we were able to obviously forgive their debt, but we also were able to work and get their credit history updated. In the eviction contest, I couldn't agree with you more. They're going to go up once the federal government stops giving us money, and what happened during COVID sort of comes home to roost. More and more people are going to be evicted, and not having due process in that procedure is going to be what really crushes us, and not having civil get in, but not having counsel for folks that can go to a judge or go to a landlord and make a deal, for example, that they can be evicted, but it won't show up on their record. That happens all the time. It happens with Many of us maybe have been to court where you got a speeding ticket and you pay the bill, but you don't get the points. And that's the kind of thing we need to really look at, because COVID is a crisis situation. As I said earlier, we need a governor who's dealt with crisis situations in government in the past, and that is one of the situations that I, as governor, will look forward to handling.
Yes, for brevity, the first answer is no, it's not fair. And the second answer is yes, we should do something about it. And I associate myself with the remarks of all my distinguished colleagues here. And
really wants to bring
this is yeah, this is getting serious up here. So
Thank you, Mr. Franchot. We're getting you there. I promise. Let's loop back around. Mr. Perez.
You know, it's important to understand that eviction is not just a cause of poverty, it's a symptom of poverty. And we need to understand that and respond to it. And where I respectfully disagree with some of the comments I've heard here is I refuse to believe that it has to be that way, that we're going to have a spate of additional evictions. We can control this. I can't control Larry Hogan now, and he hasn't done, we've all discussed what he hasn't done. But I refuse to believe that we just have to throw up our arms and just accept that that's what it is. I don't buy that. And I will fight like heck to make sure that doesn't happen. And I won't repeat all of the foreclosure or eviction prevention things that other states have done. This can be done. This should be done. And one other thing I would add to it is I would sit down with credit agencies, because you get evicted, it really screws your credit in a big way. And we need to figure out how to ameliorate that. And so I take issue with, yes, this is going to happen, because it doesn't have to. And I applaud the Democrats in the House of Delegates and in the state Senate who refuse to believe that and who are fighting like heck to make sure we do this. You know, like I said, we're 29th, according to the Eviction Lab. We're 29th in the country on eviction prevention measures. That's mediocre at best on at first glance, and we should be the best state in the country. We can be the best state in the country, but only if we have sustained executive leadership on this issue.
And I agree that we should not just consider this just a foregone conclusion. You know, there are certain measures that we have to be able to do. You know, I think what was mentioned earlier about being able to erase the eviction filing fee, that must happen. Because Maryland is so out of step with where the rest of the country is, and in a very unnecessary and unfair way. We need to have policies when it comes to things like when it comes to things like eviction fees that are actually fair and equitable. And what we have in the state of Maryland is not that. We do need to have a fundamental right to counsel. Right? We need to have a chance, and these are issues that, again, I've been fighting on these issues for my entire adult life. And you look at the work we just recently did on the fight for the right to counsel, this is things that should fundamentally be a right. But we also know that the lifting of the emergency eviction moratorium was unnecessary and unjustified. Because lifting the moratorium somehow means that we are somehow out of an emergency. Just yesterday, we had 1,000 cases, confirmed COVID cases, within the state of Maryland. When that eviction moratorium was lifted, when the emergency piece was lifted off, the reason and the justification was that, well, we're now at 100. We're not there anymore. We're back at 1,000. We have kids going back into school. We are trying to revive an economy. So it is not a foregone conclusion that somehow we have to deal with this wave. What we have to do is to push. What we have to do is to urge. What we have to do is lead with data. And what we need to do is make sure that the emergency component to this gets reinstated as it's happening in other states around the country, where you're looking at whether it's New York or Colorado, they're talking about reinstating this until January and until next summer. We are still in the middle of emergency, and we need to act accordingly.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. So, at the risk of angering you, which I don't think I will, we're going to forego the follow-ups for this round, if that's all right, unless there's a burning follow-up that someone has. Mr. Franchot, I couldn't see you behind the flag again. I'm so sorry. No? Oh. Oh. Sorry. One of your colleagues was pointing to you to try to give you the layout. Okay, so what we're going to do, thank you again. Let's give a round of applause for our candidates for their very thorough answers and their endurance here. So just a bit of stage direction. We're going to give these folks a break under the lights. We're going to take a couple-minute break, a 5-minute break, to play a PSA from our county executive, which, as I understand, is already playing online, perhaps. So I'm play in the room. We're going to come back and answer a couple of audience questions, and I mean a couple, and then we'll get you out of here pretty soon. So thank you very much, and fuel up for the very short second half.
Good evening. I'm Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich, and I have 3 things to tell you tonight. First, if you're a renter who's gotten behind on your rent because of the pandemic, we may be able to help you. In Montgomery County, eligible renters can receive up to $12,000 in rental assistance, but you must apply for it. Go to montgomerycountymd.gov/renters. For renters in other parts of Maryland, there's help for you as well. For a list of your county or city's rent relief programs, go to www.dhcd.maryland.gov. Don't wait to get evicted. Apply for rent relief now. The second important thing is that we are on the road to recovery from this terrible COVID-19 pandemic, but we're not going to get there together until everyone gets vaccinated. COVID-19 vaccines are free, easy, and safe. Do it for yourself, your family, your children, your neighbors, and your friends. And third, tonight we're delighted to be able to hear from candidates for governor. We appreciate their willingness to serve and look forward to hearing from them. Their views on housing policy should inform the vote of every Maryland resident, because this is a critical policy issue. I urge you to take into account what all the candidates for governor have to say on housing policy. I urge all of you, when the time comes, to get out and vote.
That's fine.
Stable, quality housing makes all of our communities safer and more prosperous. Thank you to the Renters Alliance, Renters United Maryland,
Let's see if I can.
Montgomery Community Media, and the Public Justice Center, and all of the sponsors for our state's first Democratic Gubernatorial Primary Forum focused exclusively on renters' rights, affordable housing, and the eviction crisis.
Okay.
Good evening. I'm Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich. I have 3 things to tell you tonight. First, if you're a renter who's gotten behind on your rent because of the pandemic, you may be able to help. In Montgomery County, eligible renters will receive up to $12,000 in rental assistance, but you must apply for it. Go to montgomerycountymd.gov/renters. For renters in other parts of Maryland, there's help for you.
This is really amazing.
Telling good stories are recognized.
Story is story, regardless of the language.
Everybody did a big part in this project. Everyone supported this project.
We made magic, and I'm so grateful.
We tell amazing, impactful, important stories, and we're not done.
Hello, I'm Valerie Irvin, former member of the Montgomery County Council and current board member for Montgomery Community Media. For many of us, 2020 crystallized the importance of having a source for reliable local news and information to keep our families safe. Local stories are often the most significant in our everyday lives, especially when they are influenced by the big issues of our time, like the pandemic, racial justice, local economic recovery, school closures, and more. The journalists at MyMCM post stories daily that are specifically for and about Montgomery County. And as the pandemic ends, we will be right there with you for the fun stuff, covering local community events and celebrations, high school sports, activities, and more. Those stories are delivered to your inbox every day when you sign up for the MyMCM newsletter. You get up-to-date news that has the most impact on your community, neighborhood, and family. Sign up today. It's free. That includes need-to-know headlines about our schools, economy, and political leaders, and ways that you can help your neighbors during these challenging times. Sign up for the MyMCM newsletter on our website at mymcmedia.org. Stay connected to your community and stay informed for your family.
just need to know. Thank you very much. Let me see. Oh, I need to know. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
60 seconds. All right, 60 seconds, folks. Looking for my cue. Give me the cue. And welcome back, folks, to our Democratic Party Gubernatorial Primary Candidates Forum on Housing. That is a mouthful. Hope folks appreciated the break. We're going to continue on with a couple of audience questions. Some of them do, actually revisit a little bit of what we covered before, but in a little bit more detail, and then some we haven't hit already. So hopefully we can dive right in there, and again, try to keep it pretty brief. I know y'all are hanging in there, and I appreciate it. So the first question, and this is apt, actually, since so many of you mentioned my friend and fellow board member of the Renters Alliance, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, is about just cause eviction. About just cause eviction. And so, we talked around this topic in the first block, but a lot of the questions center around, a few key points. One, if you could talk a little bit more about your understanding of just cause eviction and how it really impacts tenants or has the potential to impact tenants for the positive. And also, if you could really talk about what you would do as governor strategy-wise to work with the legislature to get it passed. And so we will, if you bear with me, we'll just jump around here a little bit. So start with Mr. King.
Sure. Well, look, we ought to have just cause eviction. I think one of the challenges in the conversation tonight is that a whole number of the issues we talked about tonight were before the General Assembly last session. There was a package, a housing justice package that at Strong Future Maryland we fought for alongside Delegate Wilkins and others, and didn't all pass. And this is one of the reasons we need a Democratic governor who campaigns on these issues so there is a clear mandate to get them done. So whether it's just cause eviction or inclusionary zoning or raising the eviction fee or funding the right to counsel, we need to campaign on those things. We need to make the case for them in every part of the state throughout the campaign. And then, as governor, you have to say, these are things we're going to do this session, and you have to lead. And that's the opportunity we have coming out of this conversation, and I'm grateful to be in a conversation where we are finally getting to some clear commitments on what folks are willing to do as governor.
Fantastic. Yes.
So I think, part of what's important for a governor to do is not duplicate any efforts. We already have a blueprint from what delegates Janelle Wilkin and others have really put forward. And this goes back to even when I was working at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, making sure we have these protections in place so that we really do finally look at increasing the availability, increasing the affordability, and increasing the sustainability of housing. And so all these issues have already been worked on many times, and we can just look at what great delegates and great elected officials have already done and just try to make sure that we have the leadership in Annapolis to do so as governor.
Yeah, we have to have a governor who stands for the principle that people should not be evicted from their home unless there's just cause to do so. And housing is a right. We all agree with that up here. And you can't start to focus on crime, education, transportation, climate change, or any of the other issues out there if you don't have a home to live in. And we've all seen people, know homeless folks. We walk down the streets. You go to a place like San Francisco where every block there's a homeless person, and we want to protect our tenants, and we want to make sure people are not evicted and not evicted for the wrong reason. But I think to Mr. King's point, you need a Democrat who is going to work with the legislature. I would add to that, who has worked with the legislature during the course of their careers. I have for 16 years, to get things done, to move bills, to work with people in the General Assembly. We have a great team here in District 20. We have a great congressman here, Jamie Raskin, and we need to be able to work with folks in the legislature to make sure we put in protections to keep people from getting evicted, including just cause, and that they have a lawyer in case they are evicted without just cause.
Can I just give everybody my personal cell phone number? I want you to contact me on this and other issues, but it's 301 area code. Jot it down because I'm keeping the same number as governor, and you won't have to call staff. You can call me. 301 area code, 332-1961. And on the specific question, I have nothing but the utmost respect. I served for 20 years representing Tacoma Park and Silver Spring. So Delegate Wilkins, I understand sometimes the difficulties where you have a good bill and you have a veto-proof majority of Democrats in the House of Delegates and in the Maryland Senate. Veto-proof. Yet the bill doesn't make progress and get passed. So, yeah, we need justice, and we need to do the right things by our tenants. But it's not just a matter of, all of us on the stage saying, yeah, we agree with the legislation, and we wish it had passed. The issue is, how did we get in this situation in the first place? Megan, I think it was her first name, asked me out in the hallway during the break, what in God's name is going on? The money is there for the landlords. What is the problem with communicating with everybody that we want to pay them $750 million in past rent due and making that happen? And it goes back to my point about competence and implementation.
Thanks so much.
So, like 2 minutes up? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a cell phone that went off. That hurt me. But anyway, thank you guys. Personally, I just want to thank each of you for being here because you're just so great, and I'm inspired by you.
Thank you, Mr. Franchot.
Mr. Comptroller, I left you a message. I just wanted you to know. Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. You know, this past session in Annapolis was an historic session, thanks to Democrats. So much was accomplished by so many remarkable Democrats. The set of issues, in my judgment, that were the biggest disappointment to me that didn't make it across the finish line were the package of housing reforms. And I see Delegate Von Stewart here and others, Delegate Wilkins, and so many others worked so hard on it. And as I reflect on this whole conversation of tonight, there's no less than 2 or 3 categories of things we need to do. Number one is get back to the legislature and keep trying, because we know the arc of success. If first you don't succeed, try again. Success is about persistence, and it's not just cause, but it's other things. I'd like to deal with appraisal issues in the home purchase context and some real barriers to entry for people who are trying to buy a home in the appraisal context. I've worked on this issue. But then the other thing, and I mentioned it in an earlier question, is we need to reinvent the Department of Housing and Community Development. We need to reinvent the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation, because the incompetence right now in dealing with people who have lost their jobs is breathtaking, and it's unacceptable. And when I had the privilege of being your labor secretary, and before that working in the Civil Rights Division, leading the division, that was what we undertook, and so much of what we accomplished. Yes, it was about doing regs and doing laws, but it was about changing the culture of agencies. That ain't sexy, but it's indispensable to success. And one of the things I will work on day one is making sure that we empower dedicated career professionals, that we augment their talent with additional folks who understand the mission, because we need to be leading agencies that are equipped for the moment. And in all too many contexts, we're not. I talk to delegates and senators all the time. I ask them, what's your biggest thing you hear from constituents? Lost my job 6 months ago, still haven't got my benefits. I'm about to lose my apartment, I'm getting evicted. And the common denominator in both is government isn't working. Why do people distrust government? Because they see government failing. I'm going to make sure, and I am proud of the work that I have done throughout my career in making sure that we are working to bring out the best in people, to make sure that we have your backs, to make sure we're innovative. I certainly believe that we can do that, but it's going to take effort, and it's going to take folks who've been there before, and we can't afford on-the-job training. And that's why I'm so excited about these opportunities.
Thanks so
we
much.
can do this.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, we need to be vigilant when it comes to protecting the rights of tenants. We need to make sure that is a clear and a core North Star about how we think about our policies. When you think about the work that happened with the entire housing justice package, it is not just remarkable work, it was important work. And I tell you, I mean, the leadership that Delegate Wilkins and Delegate Stewart and so many others showed in this is special. But the reality is that right now it is true that you are putting together legislation that you're not even just concerned about, do you have the votes for passage? You're worried about, do you have the votes for an override, for a veto override? That's something that we know that we can and we will address when it comes January 2023 in the session for then. But I tell you this, when we're talking about these issues, and we think about them in context of work, wages, and wealth, we think about them in context of the fact that 24% of people who lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were people who were living in poverty before COVID-19, i.e. the working poor. People who were working, in some cases, multiple jobs and still living below the poverty line. When we're talking about things like how do we make rent more affordable, and how do we think about preventing eviction and just cause, all really important things. The other thing we must also couple that with is how are we making sure that people are getting paid a fair wage, so they're then capable and able to be able to afford the rents. Because if these two things do not happen simultaneously, then we are going to have a massive challenge. And you know, Tom was right, in the last legislative session, I was very proud to work with Senator Antonio Hayes on Baltimore on how we think about fair appraisal value. Because legislations like the one that I worked on with Senator Hayes on, it is also about how are we thinking about the renters' rights, and how are we thinking about, for those who are choosing to go from rent to own, how are we making that process easier for them as well? We have to think holistically, as the housing justice package did, about how we think about housing in a fair and an equitable way within our state.
Thanks so much for that from all of you. But before I go on to the next question, just want to do, and you all have helped me with this, but want to quickly recognize the elected officials that have joined us in the audience tonight. So, of course, Delegate Janelle Wilkins is here from District 20. Thank you, Delegate Wilkins. Delegate Vaughn Stewart from District 19 is here. Stewart. Mayor Kate Stewart from Tacoma Park is here. Mayor Stewart. And at-large County Council Member Will Jawando as well. Thank you, Councilmember Jawando. We thank you all. So I'm actually, in the interest of time, going to combine two questions, so bear with me. And these center on some of the topics that we've broached a couple of times, the intersection of race and personal economics and housing and justice. And so the first, asks or posits, Maryland continues to reel from centuries of racist housing and transportation policies, producing segregated and disinvested communities. How would you as governor address this systemic racism in housing and transportation? You can talk a little bit about what kind of transit-oriented development plans would it be included in your housing plans? Talk a little bit, this question asks to talk about the Red Line project, which we talked about a little bit already, but be free to hear folks expound upon that. The other question, also about equity and control for renters, which basically gets down to, what kind of shared housing equity plans you'll have, whether, that might include support for community land trusts or housing co-ops, similar housing options that provide the opportunity for renters to build equity, control in their housing and wealth themselves while keeping it permanently affordable. So I know that's a compound question, but if you all could talk a little bit both about your views on breaking down those historic systemic racial barriers and as that relates to housing and transportation issues, and about some of your more far-reaching ideas and plans to promote that kind of shared equity in housing for tenants. So I will throw this one to whomever wants to start, as a matter of fact. Mr. Jain. Oh, sorry, Mr. Perez. Mr. Jain, then Perez. Yeah.
So I think part of the solution is diversifying the administration. As governor, you would be running and appointing people to run a lot of these agencies, enact a lot of these policies, enforce these policies. One of the jobs I had in the Obama White House was in an office called Presidential Personnel. And so we were literally the team that found, recruited, appointed, and retained every political appointee in the federal government, including cabinet-level secretaries, chiefs of staff, and junior-level special assistants. And specifically, I was part of a 3-person team that helped make sure that the applicants for those jobs reflected the diversity and lived experiences of those that we were representing, our constituents. And so if I was elected governor, I would make sure that the people who are running my housing agency, my labor agency, you name it, actually are in the shoes of those constituents that we're trying to best serve. And then the second part of that solution is looking at those real structural reforms. Look at how you're campaigning, because oftentimes how you campaign leads into how you're going to govern. I am the first statewide candidate in America to be 100% volunteer run, guarantee that all my events are free and accessible to everyone, and I'm not taking a dime from anyone who is contributing to the issues that we're talking about tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. Mr. Perez, I saw your hand up next.
Sure. Happy to do that.
Sure, of course.
We're caught up, as Dr. King often said, in this inescapable web of mutuality. When you mentioned our legacy of racism in this state, you mentioned transportation and housing. It doesn't end there.
Of course.
We have one of the highest incarceration rates of black men. We see racial disparities in access to health care, maternal infant mortality. And that is why we have all of these challenges. We're the richest state in the country, and yet we have so many pockets of poverty. Why is that, and how do we do this? In moments of crisis, we see moments of opportunity, and this is one of them. The reason why a regional transit authority is so critical for the Baltimore region, it includes but isn't limited to light rail that takes us from west to east. That is a linchpin of it, but it's not the only answer. We need to dramatically increase the number of our buses. We need to make sure that people can get from home to work. If you live in Southwest Baltimore and you're transit dependent right now, and you want to get to the Port of Baltimore for all these new offshore wind jobs, it might as well be the Port of Philadelphia. And those weren't my words. Those were the words of someone I met in Southwest Baltimore when we were talking about offshore wind. So this is an inescapable web of mutuality. And everything we do as governor, everything I will do if I have the privilege, will be filtered through a racial equity lens, through economic justice. We can do all these things. And we have an unprecedented opportunity with the Biden administration and these investments in our infrastructure, whether it's our child care infrastructure as well as our transit infrastructure.
Thanks.
These are all about what we can do, and this has been my life. Jobs and justice, civil rights and labor rights. That's the essence of this question, and that's been the essence of my career in public service.
Thanks so much, Mr. Perez. Mr. Moore?
Thank you. We are blessed that we do live in one of the wealthiest states in this country, yet we also live in a state that has an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap. 8-to-1. And again, the history of these issues and the challenges that have happened, we have to understand it's not because one group works 8 times harder. There's legacy around these issues. And frankly, over the past decade, we've only seen the racial wealth gap increase in the state of Maryland. Because there's also a fundamental difference between income and wealth. When we're talking about the things we have to push on, the North Stars within our administration, within the Moore administration, it will be work and wages and wealth. And how are we making all three of those things real, and how are we making all three of those pathways real? And this is not something that is just new or academic. These are issues that I've been working on for my entire professional career. When I think about the work that we were able to do, understanding the distinct differences that happens when it comes to capital going to nonprofit organizations that were led by people of people of color versus nonprofit organizations that were not. You know, people always talk about venture capital. Well, only 2% of venture capital goes towards entrepreneurs of color. Well, philanthropy is not that much better. And for all of us in the nonprofit sector, I think we know exactly what we're talking about. If you look at the past 20 years, there's been a 400% increase in philanthropic giving. During the same period of time, only 10% of organizations led by people of color got that capital. And if you look at black, the number reduces down to 2. So while a CEO of Robinhood, we launched an initiative called the Power Fund, which was over an $18 million fund that was exclusively focused on supporting social entrepreneurs of color. We launched an initiative called 90 to 0, which was addressing the racial wealth gap in a cross-sectoral way, where we're able to bring the private sector and the nonprofit sector and universities, everyone who has their hand on the lever of justice has a role to play in terms of what they do and in terms of how we work together to be able to address the issue of the racial wealth gap. It is something that will happen with our administration. This will not be a lane, this will be a lens in the way we do our work. The second question, thank you. The second question.
Thank you, Mr.
About Baltimore. Did you want me to answer the second part of the question?
We're kind of running up against it, but appreciate
I'll just say
it.
one thing very quickly. I understand that I'm running for governor of Maryland, but I also understand I'm a very proud Baltimorean. And when we're talking about the issues, and people say, well, how does poverty show itself? How does economic opportunity, economic inequality show itself? Does it show itself in housing or transportation or education or food? The answer is yes. And that's the way we have to be able to address it when it comes to thinking about, yes, we are going to have a red line plus in our administration. And we are going to think about all the other mechanisms about how we think about east-west transit, and that I can get into in another question.
Much appreciated, much appreciated. And then there were three. Mr. King, Mr. Gansler, Mr. Franchot.
No, when I was first elected comptroller, I was realized that I was now the vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of the State Retirement Board of Trustees. And so I showed up at the first meeting. That was back when the fund was about $40 billion. Now it's almost $70 billion. But they were making a presentation as to the hundreds of millions of dollars they pay in fees to money managers. And I put my hand up and said, gee, how many of our money managers investing Maryland pension money, how many of them are African American, Hispanic, women, and not people that just look like me? And the answer was, we have 52 money managers, they're all white males. We said, this has to change. Well, the other trustees all jumped up and said, you can't do that. That's a fiduciary duty that we have to avoid social issues. We have to, gobbledygook, gobbledygook, gobbledygook. Okay. So anyway, we created a program. We had to name it Latin, a Latin name, because they didn't want to offend the, people on Wall Street. So it was named the Terra Maria Program. And in the first several years, we deliberately targeted $2 billion in pension money to women and minority money managers. Here's what made me so happy. They knocked the socks off the incumbent white male money managers. So now we have $12 billion invested with minority and women managers. And that's just an example of, we have historic racism. I thought the questions were terrific. I mean, it's there. We've all heard about redlining. I mentioned that. What the state of Maryland has to do is go in a very aggressive way, green line the areas and the communities that have been redlined. And we can do that because we're a wealthy state with a lot of debt capacity and a lot of internal economic strong bones. So I would advocate that as a North Star for us in the state of Maryland, because if we don't aggressively put the state's statutory, regulatory, and financial clout behind an effort like that, it's never going to happen. I'm going to have a Secretary of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. all the folks that I go and see all over the state, black businessmen particularly, they look at me and say, every year you guys come back and say you're going to do this, that, and that. Nothing ever happens.
Thanks so much.
It's going to happen under me, and we're going to improve that entire economic picture and include
Thanks so much, Mr.
ownership with
Franchot.
it. Thank you.
Much appreciated. Mr. King, Mr. Gansler, please.
Yeah, I said during the break, I was talking to Dale, and we talked about how great it is that everybody's been sort of wedded to the theme of the night that we were told to stay wedded to, which is affordable housing and evictions. I think we've just gone off the rails on that. But I actually think there's something to that, which is that all of these issues are inextricably tied. Housing is inextricably tied to jobs, inextricably tied to education, access to health, and criminal justice, for examples. And I've done all of those issues, and I've actually worked to make sure that we tap into the potential of every Marylander, no matter what they look like, no matter where they come from. And I've taken on, at times of crisis like we are now, as we have COVID, as we come out of COVID, and on the issues that we're talking about, when I led the national mortgage foreclosure crisis and got $2 billion into Maryland to keep people in their homes, to get them housing counseling, to go after, whether it's in criminal justice, when I was the head of the NAACP Criminal Justice Committee here right in Montgomery County in 1989 and started police reform then, by putting in community prosecution, by putting in drug courts, by putting in teen court, by putting in domestic violence courts, by starting the Family Justice Center here in Montgomery County. These are things that you actually have to have done before if you're going to do them again. And we need to have somebody who's led during a time of crisis. We're in a crisis right now. We haven't even touched on women's reproductive rights, what's going on in Texas and what's going to go on this fall in the Supreme Court, and it becomes that much more imperative that we have a Democrat that can actually win the primary and the general election in what is going to be one of the most Republican years we've seen in decades.
Thanks so much.
I'll turn that right over to Mr. King.
Thanks so much, Mr. Gansler. Mr. King, bring us home.
Look, I'm glad you framed the question the way you did, because our issues around racial equity are a matter of deep historical legacy in this state, and we often aren't comfortable talking about that. But we're having this conversation in Silver Spring, which is where I live. It's about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The property where he was enslaved, still owned by the family that are direct line descendants of the family that owned my family. The cabin in which he lived with his family as enslaved people, still standing on the property. I've had the opportunity to stand inside of that cabin and contemplate the reality that so many of the injustices that we have today, so many of the inequities that we have today, are an extension of that history. But I'm also blessed to be able to say that in my family, in 3 generations, we went from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first black president. That's a powerful statement about what's possible if we create opportunity. So what does it mean to create opportunity? Well, we have to make sure that folks have access to housing to do that, and we have to be concrete about what that means. A state bank helps create the resources to build affordable housing. A state bank helps create the resources to build co-op housing. A state bank helps create the resources to do social housing, which other countries do, where you have public institutions that build housing with labor, with union labor, that then is maintained as affordable housing. Right? But we have to commit to specific legislative action. For example, and I'll close with this, we should have, just like we have a budget impact statement for every piece of legislation that's considered in Annapolis, we should have a racial equity impact statement for every piece of legislation, right? And we should have to answer for every bill, how will this impact our long history of racial inequity in the state?
Thank you so very much. Let's give a big round of applause to all of our candidates, please. I want to thank you all very, very much for an incredibly substantive and deep conversation. Thank you to our reporters for adding to the questions and moving the conversation along. And thank you all here in the audience in the room and watching at home. We hope that this conversation, one, made you want to learn more about where our candidates are on housing issues, but also helps you make an informed choice and makes you want to advocate more as a tenant, as a housing advocate, as a community member, because we do believe that housing is a right, and we believe it's going to take all of us to get these policy decisions right. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a fantastic evening, and good night.